The wild stallion reared up on its hind legs, eyes rolling white with fury as the pristine corporate executives stumbled backward in their designer shoes. CEO Victoria Carter stood there laughing, pointing at the janitor in his worn uniform, making an impossible bet that would humiliate him in front of everyone. She had no idea who she was challenging. She didn't know about the ranch, the rodeo championships, or the tragedy that stole everything from him. She couldn't have predicted that in 60 seconds, this humble single father, pushing a mop cart, would mount that untamed beast and ride it like poetry in motion, leaving her speechless and the entire company in absolute shock. What happened next would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about success, worth, and the people she'd spent years looking down upon. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Mountain Resort as 3 luxury buses pulled into the circular driveway, their chrome fixtures gleaming like promises of corporate success. Victoria Carter stepped off the first bus with the confidence of someone who had conquered every room she'd ever entered, her stiletto heels clicking against the cobblestone path with military precision. At 42 years old, she commanded titanium technologies with an iron fist wrapped in Armani silk, having built the software empire from a garage startup to a $3.7 billion corporation in just 15 years. Her raven black hair was pulled into a severe bun that matched the sharp angles of her jawline, and her ice blue eyes scanned the resort grounds with the calculating gaze of a hawk surveying prey. Behind her, 83 employees filed off the buses in varying states of enthusiasm, chattering about the mandatory 3-day corporate retreat that Victoria had organized to celebrate another record-breaking fiscal quarter. Vice President Marcus Chen loosened his tie and complained loudly about leaving his family for a weekend of trust exercises and team-building nonsense, while junior developer Priya Kapoor bounced on her toes with genuine excitement, thrilled to see the famous resort she'd only read about in travel magazines. The resort sprawled across 200 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, featuring a main lodge built from reclaimed timber that looked like something from a billionaire's fever dream, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows, stone fireplaces large enough to roast an ox, and enough Edison bulbs to light a small city. Inside the service entrance, hidden from the arriving guests by a carefully maintained hedge of blue spruce trees, Dante Rodriguez pushed his industrial cleaning cart down a narrow hallway, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished concrete floor. At 38 years old, he moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago to make himself invisible, to exist in the spaces between other people's attention. His dark hair was flecked with premature gray at the temples, and deep lines around his warm brown eyes spoke of sleepless nights and worries that never quite disappeared with the morning light. The navy blue janitor's uniform hung loose on his lean frame, a frame that had once been 20 pounds heavier with ranch-hardened muscle before life had worn him down to essentials. His shift had started at 5 in the morning, as it did every day except Sundays, which he reserved entirely for his daughter Isabella. At 7 years old, she was the axis around which his entire world rotated. The reason he took every extra shift the resort manager offered, the reason he smiled when his back screamed and his hands cracked and bled from industrial cleaning solutions. This morning, he'd already scrubbed 3 conference rooms, replaced the soap dispensers in all 8 second-floor bathrooms, and removed a mysterious stain from the hallway carpet outside room 214 that he preferred not to think about too carefully. Now, he was headed to the main ballroom to set up chairs for the welcome breakfast that would kick off the Titanium Technologies retreat. He thought about Isabella as he worked, letting the familiar worry spiral through his mind like water circling a drain. She'd been coughing again last night, that wet rattling sound that made his stomach clench with fear every time he heard it. The asthma medications helped, but they cost $340 every month, even with his bare-bones insurance plan, and last month when she'd needed a nebulizer treatment at the emergency room, the bill had been $2,800 that he was still paying off in $50 monthly installments. He'd called her during his morning break, and Mrs. Chen from apartment 3B had assured him that Isabella had eaten her oatmeal and taken her inhaler before the school bus arrived, but the worry never quite left him, humming in the background of his thoughts like an engine that couldn't be shut off. The ballroom was cathedral-like in its proportions, with exposed wooden beams arching 40 feet overhead and crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than Dante would earn in 5 years. He began unfolding chairs from the storage racks, arranging them in precise rows of 12, the way the resort's event coordinator had demonstrated during his first week on the job 9 months ago. The work was mindless, which was both a blessing and a curse, because it left his thoughts free to wander, and they always wandered to places he'd rather not go. To the ranch in Montana where he'd grown up, where the wind smelled like grass and leather and his father's cigarette smoke. To the horses, God, the horses, noble creatures with eyes that saw straight through to your soul, muscles rippling beneath satin coats, hooves that could crush bones or dance like ballerinas depending on the relationship between rider and beast. He'd been riding since before he could properly walk, strapped to his father's back in some kind of improvised harness, while the old man worked the horses that made up half their livelihood. By age 5, Dante had his own quarter horse named Pepper, a patient mare with a white blaze down her face, who tolerated his clumsy attempts at horsemanship with the forbearance of a saint. By age 10, he could break a green horse in 3 weeks, earning money from neighboring ranchers who'd heard about the Rodriguez kid with magic hands. By age 16, he was competing in junior rodeo circuits across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, racking up buckles and prize money and a reputation as someone who could ride anything with 4 legs and a heartbeat. The memories threatened to pull him under, so he shook his head sharply and focused on the chairs, counting under his breath. 24, 25, 26. The ballroom needed seating for 96, arranged in 8 sections of 12, with aisles wide enough for servers to navigate with coffee carafes and pastry trays. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, unfolding, positioning, aligning, creating order from chaos in the small ways that made up his entire existence now. He thought about the irony sometimes, how he'd gone from controlling 1,500-pound animals with nothing but his voice and the pressure of his knees to controlling nothing at all. Not even his own fate, just cleaning up after people who probably earned more in a day than he made in a year. A sharp voice cut through his thoughts like a blade through butter. "Excuse me, are you supposed to be in here?" Victoria Carter stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 members of her executive team, her expression suggesting she'd just discovered something mildly offensive stuck to her shoe. Dante straightened immediately, instincts from a childhood of cowering before his father's unpredictable rages kicking in before he could suppress them. "Yes, ma'am, I'm setting up for your breakfast meeting," he said quietly, gesturing to the half-finished rows of chairs. "The event coordinator asked me to have everything ready by 8 o'clock. Victoria's eyes traveled over him with the dismissive speed of someone cataloging something beneath notice, taking in the janitor's uniform, the worn sneakers, the calloused hands. "Well, could you hurry it up? We're starting early, and I don't want staff wandering around when we're trying to conduct business." The casual rudeness in her tone wasn't even intentional, Dante realized. This was just how she spoke to people she considered beneath her, with the absent disdain of someone brushing away a mosquito. "Of course. I'll be finished in 10 minutes, he said, already turning back to the chairs, making himself small and unimportant, a skill he'd perfected over 9 months of invisible labor. Victoria made a small sound of acknowledgement and disappeared, her heels clicking away down the hall like castanets. The 2 executives who'd been with her, a red-haired woman in a pantsuit and a man who looked barely old enough to shave, exchanged glances that might have been sympathy or amusement. Dante couldn't tell and didn't particularly care. He finished the chairs in 7 minutes instead of 10, working with the quick precision of someone who'd learned that exceeding expectations sometimes bought you a few moments of peace, then wheeled his cart out through the service door, making sure to move slowly and quietly so as not to disturb the important people who were beginning to filter into the ballroom. The morning passed in its usual blur of tasks. He cleaned the men's restroom on the 3rd floor, where someone had apparently tried to flush an entire roll of paper towels, requiring him to shut off the water main and manually clear the pipes with a plunger and a prayer. He restocked the housekeeping closet on the fourth floor with fresh linens that smelled like industrial lavender detergent. He mopped the lobby floor, navigating around clusters of Titanium Technologies employees who stood in circles talking about user interfaces and market penetration, their voices carrying that particular brand of enthusiasm that came from people who genuinely loved their work and were compensated obscenely well for it. Around 11 o'clock, Dante grabbed his lunch from his locker, a turkey sandwich on wheat bread that he'd made the night before, while Isabella practiced her spelling words at the kitchen table. He ate alone in the break room, a windowless space with fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, and a microwave that took 3 minutes to heat anything, regardless of what the buttons promised. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen, a photo of Isabella grinning gap-toothed at the camera, giving a thumbs up. "All good today, no coughing," the message read. Dante felt something unclench in his chest, and he allowed himself a small smile before finishing his sandwich and returning to work. The afternoon brought him to the resort's auxiliary buildings, a collection of rustic structures scattered across the property that included a spa, a small movie theater, stables for guests who wanted to try horseback riding, and a massive equipment barn that housed everything from snowmobiles to kayaks depending on the season. He was supposed to clean the tack room in the stables, a job he'd been avoiding for weeks because being around horses again, even just smelling the leather and hay, opened doors in his memory that he preferred to keep locked. But the resort manager had specifically requested it today because some of the corporate guests might want riding lessons, and Dante couldn't afford to lose this job by being difficult about assignments. The stables were designed to look authentically Western while maintaining resort-level luxury, which meant the stalls had heated floors and the horses ate better than most people in developing countries. 6 horses lived here permanently, beautiful creatures maintained primarily for aesthetic purposes, and the occasional trail ride led by college students earning summer money. Dante pushed open the heavy door, and the smell hit him like a physical force, that indescribable combination of hay and manure and horse sweat and leather that had defined the first 22 years of his life. His hands started shaking, and he had to set down his cleaning supplies and just breathe for a moment, remembering. The tack room was exactly as he'd expected, lined with saddles on wooden stands, bridles hanging from hooks, blankets folded neatly on shelves. He began methodically wiping down each piece of equipment with saddle soap, his hands falling into the familiar rhythm without conscious thought. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 9 years of other jobs and other lives, his fingers knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, how to work the soap into the leather without damaging it, how to check for weak spots in the stitching that might give way under stress. He lost himself in the work, and for the first time in months felt something that might have been peace, or at least the absence of active anxiety. He didn't hear anyone approach until a voice behind him said, "Well, this is a surprise. Didn't know we had real talent hiding in the maintenance crew." Dante spun around to find a man in his 60s standing in the doorway, weathered face split in a grin that revealed several gold teeth, bow-legged stance, marking him as someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. This was Marcus, the resort's head wrangler, a transplant from Wyoming who'd been working here for 15 years and ran the riding program with military efficiency. "Just doing my job," Dante said carefully, turning back to the saddle he'd been cleaning. Marcus wandered into the room, running his hand along the bridles with the casual familiarity of an expert. "That's some job. Most people don't know saddle soap from shoe polish, but you're working that leather like you've done it before." Dante didn't respond, focusing intently on a stubborn spot near the pommel, hoping the old man would get bored and leave. "I've been watching you, you know," Marcus continued, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "The way you move around the horses when you're cleaning the stalls. Most folks, they're nervous, keep their distance, don't know how to read the animals. But you walk right up to them, confident-like. That big gray mare, Stormy, she's skittish as hell around strangers, tried to bite the last 3 guests who came in for lessons. But you walked past her stall yesterday, and she came right up to the gate, calm as Sunday morning." Dante felt his stomach tighten, the uncomfortable sensation of being seen when he'd worked so hard to remain invisible. "I grew up around horses," he admitted quietly, hoping that would be the end of it. "That's so. Where at?" Marcus pressed, genuine curiosity in his tone. Montana, small ranch outside of Billings. No kidding, I spent 5 years working ranches around Billings back in the day. What was your family's spread called? Dante hesitated, weighing the risk of revealing too much against the rudeness of refusing to answer a direct question. Rodriguez Ranch, about 40 acres, nothing fancy. Marcus's eyes lit up with recognition. Rodriguez. Wait, are you related to Miguel Rodriguez? Guy who used to run those horse-breaking clinics every summer? Dante's hands stilled on the saddle, his throat suddenly tight. That was my father, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Holy hell, I took one of his clinics back in '89 or '90. Best 2 weeks of my life. Learned more about reading horses from Miguel than I did in 20 years of trial and error. Your dad was a legend, son. Whatever happened to him? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Dante felt the familiar weight of grief settle on his shoulders, heavy as a wet blanket. He passed away 11 years ago. Heart attack, quick and clean. That was the sanitized version, leaving out the bottle of whiskey Miguel had consumed that day, the decades of anger and violence that had rotted him from the inside, until his heart simply gave up the fight. I'm sorry to hear that, Marcus said, and his sympathy seemed genuine. So what brings you here, working maintenance when you've got horse sense like that? We could use someone with real skill helping with the riding program. Dante shook his head immediately, the panic rising fast and sharp. I appreciate that, but I'm not looking to change positions. I've got my daughter to think about, and this job works with my schedule. It was a weak excuse, and from the look on Marcus's face, the old wrangler knew it. But he had the grace not to push. Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. We've got a new stallion coming in next week, temperamental as hell from what I hear, and I could use an extra set of experienced hands. Dante nodded noncommittally, already planning to be as far from the stables as possible when that horse arrived, and returned to his cleaning with renewed focus until Marcus finally left him alone. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of October day where the sky looked like something painted by an optimist. Brilliant blue stretching from horizon to horizon without a single cloud to interrupt its perfection. Dante had worked the early shift again, arriving at the resort before dawn to prepare the grounds for the second day of the Titanium Technologies retreat. Today's schedule included team-building exercises on the south lawn, something involving trust falls and rope courses that Dante had helped set up the previous evening, under the direction of a perky activities coordinator who used the word synergy 17 times in 20 minutes. By 10 in the morning, he was emptying trash cans near the lawn when the corporate group began filtering out of the lodge, dressed in the casual athletic wear that wealthy people paid premium prices to look like they weren't trying. Victoria Carter was at the center of the group as always, her presence commanding attention like gravity, wearing yoga pants that probably cost more than Dante's monthly rent, and a fitted jacket with the Titanium Technologies logo embroidered in silver thread. She was in the middle of what appeared to be an animated conversation with Marcus Chen about quarterly projections when the activities coordinator blew a whistle and started organizing everyone into teams. Dante kept his head down, working his way along the perimeter of the gathering, pulling trash bags from bins and replacing them with smooth efficiency. He had learned early in this job that the key to being ignored was consistency of movement, never stopping long enough to register as a person in anyone's peripheral vision, just another part of the resort's machinery humming along in the background. The corporate employees were too focused on their exercises anyway, laughing and groaning through trust falls and three-legged races, the forced camaraderie of people who spent 50 hours a week together trying to access something resembling genuine human connection. Around 11:30, a commotion near the stables drew everyone's attention, voices rising in alarm and excitement. Dante looked up to see Marcus hustling toward the group, moving faster than a man his age should probably move, his face flushed with what looked like equal parts embarrassment and anger. "Folks, we've got a situation," he announced, slightly out of breath. "The stallion that was supposed to arrive next week came in early this morning, and he's even more difficult than advertised. Threw his handler in the trailer, and we're having trouble getting him unloaded. I apologize for the disruption." Victoria's eyes lit up with the particular gleam of someone spotting an opportunity for entertainment. A difficult horse? Well, that sounds much more interesting than trust falls. Can we watch? Marcus hesitated, clearly torn between customer service and common sense. Ma'am, I don't think that's a good idea. This animal is legitimately dangerous, and we're going to need to call in a specialist to handle him. Nobody here has the experience for this kind of situation. But Victoria was already walking toward the stables, her entire team falling in behind her like ducklings following their mother, and Marcus had no choice but to trail along, throwing worried glances over his shoulder. Dante felt his feet moving before his brain authorized the decision, drawn by something he couldn't quite name, following the crowd at a careful distance. The scene at the stables was controlled chaos, 3 handlers standing around a horse trailer with the ramp down, peering inside at what Dante could only see as a mass of heaving shadow and fury. Even from 30 feet away, he could hear the stallion inside, the thunderous sound of hooves striking metal, the high whistling scream that horses make when they're terrified or enraged beyond reason. The trailer rocked on its suspension, and one of the handlers backed away quickly, nearly tripping over his own feet. "What's the problem?" Victoria asked with the breezy confidence of someone who'd never encountered a genuinely unsolvable situation. Marcus gestured helplessly at the trailer. "The problem is that we've got an $800,000 animal in there who's decided that leaving the trailer would be worse than staying put, and he's expressing that opinion violently. The handler who brought him up from Texas got kicked in the leg trying to lead him out, and we had to call an ambulance. We're waiting for a specialist from Denver, but she won't be here for at least 3 hours." Victoria peered at the trailer with the clinical interest of someone examining an interesting specimen. "What kind of horse is he?" she asked. "Mustang mix, caught wild about 3 years ago, supposedly broken, but clearly that didn't take. Wealthy rancher bought him for his daughter. Daughter couldn't handle him, sold him to another family, same problem, and now he's ended up here. For some reason I'm still trying to understand. He's beautiful when you can see him. Black as midnight with perfect conformation, but beauty doesn't mean much when the animal wants to kill everything that moves." Marcus was clearly frustrated, the professional setback eating at him. "How much to ride him?" Victoria asked suddenly, her voice carrying that edge of challenge that Dante had heard her use in the ballroom the previous day. The question hung in the air for a moment, everyone processing what she'd just said. "Excuse me?" Marcus replied, certain he'd misheard. "I said, how much money would you need to get on that horse and ride him? Not you specifically, I mean anyone. What would that be worth?" Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass, and Dante suddenly understood what was happening. She was bored, looking for entertainment, the way wealthy Romans had probably looked at gladiators. Marcus laughed uncomfortably. "Ma'am, nobody here could ride that horse. That's why we're calling a specialist. You'd need someone with serious experience, rodeo-level skill, and even then it would be dangerous as hell." Victoria's eyes swept across the assembled crowd, landing briefly on each of her employees before moving on, calculating, judging. "So nobody here has rodeo-level skill? What about you?" She pointed at a muscular young man from her security team, a former college football player who looked like he bench-pressed small cars for fun. The kid shook his head immediately. "No, ma'am, I've never even been near a horse." "Disappointing," Victoria murmured, turning to survey the resort staff who'd gathered to watch the spectacle. Her gaze traveled across faces, dismissing each in turn, until it landed on Dante standing at the edge of the group, trash bag still in his hand. Something flickered in her expression, a cruel sort of amusement, and Dante felt ice slide down his spine. "What about you?" she called out, pointing directly at him. "You work here. Have you ever ridden a horse?" Every head turned to look at Dante, and he wanted nothing more than to disappear, to sink into the ground and cease to exist. "I've ridden before, ma'am, but nothing like that," he said carefully, trying to deflect without lying. "But you have ridden?" Victoria pressed, taking a step toward him, the crowd parting automatically to let her through. "Growing up, yes, on my family's ranch, but that was a long time ago." He was trying to keep his voice neutral, unthreatening, giving her nothing to latch onto. "A ranch? How quaint," Victoria said, her tone making it clear she found nothing quaint about it at all. "So you do have experience with horses. Tell me, janitor, what would it take for you to get on that animal in there and ride him?" The way she said janitor made it sound like an insult, a commentary on his worth as a human being, and Dante felt anger spark in his chest for the first time in years, hot and bright and dangerous. "It would take a lot more than I have, ma'am," he said, meeting her eyes directly now, breaking his own rule about staying invisible. "That horse is terrified and angry, and whoever gets on him first needs to know what they're doing, or someone's going to get seriously hurt." Victoria smiled like a shark scenting blood. "But theoretically, if you knew what you were doing, could you ride him?" Dante hesitated, the trap closing around him with teeth he could see but couldn't avoid. "Maybe, but I wouldn't, because it's not worth the risk." Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Everything has a price, janitor. Name yours." The words came out before he could stop them, pulled from that deep place where his desperation lived. "I can't name a price because I'm not for sale." Victoria's expression shifted, becoming somehow colder and more amused at the same time. "Everyone's for sale. It's just a matter of finding the right number. How about this? I'll make it interesting." She raised her voice, addressing the crowd now, playing to her audience. "If our friend here can get on that horse and stay on for 60 seconds, I'll personally write him a check for $10 million. Right here, right now, $10 million for 60 seconds of work. That's what I call a fair wage." The crowd erupted in murmurs and gasps, someone laughing like they thought it was a joke. Marcus stepped forward, alarm written across his weathered face. "Ms. Carter, I really must insist that we don't encourage anyone to attempt this. The liability alone makes this a terrible idea, and someone could get killed." Victoria waved him off with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never been told no. "I'll sign whatever waiver you need, assume all responsibility, and throw in an extra $100,000 for the resort if you'll just let this happen. Come on, Marcus, where's your sense of adventure?" Marcus looked like he wanted to argue further, but the mention of $100,000 had clearly complicated his objections. He turned to Dante with pleading eyes. "Son, you don't have to do this. Don't let her goad you into something that could get you hurt." Dante stood frozen, his mind racing through calculations that all came up wrong. $10 million would change everything, would pay off every debt, would let Isabella grow up without the weight of poverty crushing her childhood the way it had crushed his. It would mean good doctors, good schools, a house with a yard instead of a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like other people's cooking. It would mean security, safety, the luxury of not lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering how he'd pay for her next emergency room visit. But it also meant getting on an untamed stallion that wanted to hurt things, meant risking his life when he was the only parent Isabella had left, meant potentially leaving his daughter orphaned for money. "I'll do it," he heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere outside his body. Victoria's smile widened triumphantly. "Excellent decision. Marcus, get him whatever he needs." Marcus looked stricken, but moved into action, gesturing for Dante to follow him into the tack room. "Listen to me very carefully," the old wrangler said once they were alone, his voice low and urgent. "You don't have to do this. That woman is playing games with your life because she's bored and cruel, and there's no shame in walking away." Dante was already shrugging out of his janitor's jacket, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "I need the money, Marcus. My daughter has asthma, medical bills that I can't keep up with, and I've been drowning for 9 years. This is a chance, maybe the only chance I'll ever get to give her the life she deserves." Marcus studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, then. If you're determined to do this stupid thing, at least let me help you not die. What size boots do you wear?" They worked quickly, Marcus pulling out riding boots, chaps, a helmet, gloves, equipment that would give Dante at least a fighting chance. "That stallion's scared and angry, which makes him dangerous but also predictable in some ways," Marcus said as Dante changed. "He's going to try to throw you immediately, buck and twist and rear, anything to get you off his back. If you can stay centered through the first 10 seconds, show him you're not there to hurt him, you might have a chance. Talk to him, keep your voice low and steady, let him hear that you're calm even if he isn't." Dante nodded, pulling on the gloves, feeling the leather flex against his palms, familiar as coming home. His fear was still there, but underneath it something else was stirring, something he'd thought had died with his old life. Confidence, muscle memory, the deep knowledge that lived in his bones about how to read a horse, how to move with it instead of against it, how to communicate through weight and pressure and voice. "I need a saddle with a good horn and deep stirrups," he said, his voice steadier now. "And a soft bit, nothing harsh. He's already angry, and aggressive tack will just make it worse. Marcus looked at him with new respect. You really did learn from Miguel, didn't you? They selected gear together, Dante running his hands over saddles until he found one that felt right, checking every strap and buckle with the thoroughness of someone who understood that equipment failure meant death. When they emerged from the tack room, the crowd had grown. The entire Titanium Technologies team gathered along with what looked like half the resort staff, everyone wanting to witness either a miracle or a tragedy. Victoria stood at the center like a queen holding court, her phone out and recording, already imagining the story she'd tell at cocktail parties for years to come. "Ready to earn your fortune?" she called out, her voice dripping with mockery. Dante didn't answer, his focus narrowing to the trailer where the stallion was still making his fury known, hooves ringing against metal like church bells. Marcus and two other handlers approached carefully, carrying the tack, speaking in low voices as they worked out a strategy for getting close enough to the horse to saddle him. "We're going to need to tranquilize him just to get the saddle on," one handler said nervously. "No tranquilizers," Dante said firmly. "If we drug him, it'll just make him more unpredictable when he comes out of it. Let me talk to him first." He approached the trailer slowly, moving with the deliberate calm that his father had beaten into him during those long summers of horsebreaking, that careful balance between confidence and respect. The handlers backed away uncertainly, and Dante stood at the edge of the ramp, peering into the dimness. The stallion was pressed against the far wall, a huge black shape trembling with adrenaline, whites of his eyes showing, ears pinned flat against his skull. Beautiful didn't begin to describe him. He was magnificent, all power and fear and wild spirit that had been broken too many times by people who didn't understand what they were doing. "Hey there, beautiful," Dante said softly, his voice carrying into the trailer. "I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt by stupid people who thought they could force you into something you weren't ready for. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just a guy who needs your help, same as you need mine." The stallion's ears flicked forward slightly, listening despite himself. Dante kept talking, a steady stream of nonsense and comfort, letting the animal hear his tone rather than his words. "My little girl, she's 7 years old, and she's got this cough that scares me every time I hear it. She deserves better than what I can give her right now, and you deserve to be treated with respect instead of fear. So here's what I'm thinking, you and me. We help each other out here today." He stepped onto the ramp, moving inch by inch, his hands visible and empty, his body language as unthreatening as he could make it. The stallion snorted, but didn't retreat further, watching this human with wary curiosity. Dante could smell the horse's sweat, sharp and acrid, could see the fine tremors running through the massive muscles, could read the animal's body language like a book written in his native language. "That's right, I'm coming in slow. No surprises, just going to stand here with you for a minute." He made it halfway into the trailer before stopping, giving the stallion space to adjust to his presence. Behind him, he could hear Victoria's voice, loud and obnoxious. "Is he just going to have a conversation with it all day? I thought we were going to see some action." Marcus shushed her sharply. "Quiet! You're spooking the animal." Dante blocked them all out, his entire world narrowing to the space between himself and the stallion. That electric connection that forms between horse and human when both are willing to listen. He spent 5 minutes just standing there, breathing slowly, letting his heartbeat settle into something approaching calm, projecting peace into the charged atmosphere of the trailer. Finally, he extended his hand, palm up, and the stallion stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he sniffed Dante's scent. Their eyes met, and Dante felt that old magic again. That moment of recognition where two different species found common ground in mutual respect. "You're going to let me saddle you now," he said quietly. "And then you're going to let me ride you. And it's going to be okay. I promise you it's going to be okay." He backed out of the trailer carefully, gesturing for Marcus to bring the tack. "Move slow, don't make eye contact, and for God's sake, don't make any sudden movements." Getting the saddle on took 20 minutes of patient work, Dante handling each step himself while Marcus fed him equipment, talking constantly to the stallion in that low, steady voice, explaining each action before he took it. The horse trembled and flinched but didn't strike out, held in place by something deeper than fear or training, some fundamental trust that this human understood him in a way the others hadn't. When the saddle was finally cinched and the bridle in place, Dante felt sweat running down his back, despite the cool morning air, his hands shaking with adrenaline and something that might have been joy. "Now comes the interesting part," he murmured to the stallion, stroking the powerful neck. "You ready to show all these people what you're made of?" He backed the horse out of the trailer carefully, maintaining contact with the animal's shoulder, moving together like partners in a dance. When they emerged into full sunlight, the crowd gasped as one, finally seeing the stallion in all his glory. He stood over 17 hands high, coal black except for a small white star on his forehead, muscles rippling under skin that shone like polished onyx, eyes still showing white around the edges, but his ears forward now, alert rather than terrified. Victoria had her phone up, recording everything, her expression a mixture of anticipation and barely concealed hope that this would end badly enough to be entertaining. Dante felt his anger toward her spike again, then deliberately let it go, channeling the emotion into focus. He couldn't afford to think about her or the money or Isabella or anything except the animal beneath his hands and the task ahead. Marcus handed him the reins, his weathered face grave. "Mount from the offside if you can. Throw him off balance. Give yourself a second before he reacts. And for Christ's sake, keep your weight centered." Dante nodded, circling the stallion slowly, letting his hands trail along the horse's flank so the animal always knew where he was. The crowd had gone quiet, sensing they were about to witness something significant. The nervous energy palpable in the air like static before a lightning strike. He positioned himself by the right side instead of the traditional left, slipping his boot into the stirrup with practiced ease, and in one fluid motion born of 10,000 previous mounts, he swung himself up into the saddle. For one crystalline second, everything was still, horse and rider frozen in possibility, and then all hell broke loose. The stallion exploded beneath him like a bomb detonating, dropping his head between his front legs and arching his back in a buck that would have sent most riders flying into next week. But Dante had expected it, his body moving with the horse instead of against it, his weight shifting instinctively to stay centered over the stallion's shoulders, his hand gripping the saddle horn, not with panic, but with the firm pressure of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The horse twisted mid-air, a corkscrew motion designed to create impossible physics that would dislodge any rider, but Dante twisted with him. His hips loose and following the motion, his free hand out for balance. The stallion landed hard and immediately launched into a series of rapid bucks, each one more violent than the last, trying every trick in the book to unseat this human who had the audacity to climb on his back. Dante rode through them all, his face a mask of intense concentration, his body remembering skills that had been dormant for nearly a decade, but never forgotten. He began talking to the horse again, his voice somehow steady despite being thrown around like a rag doll. "That's it. Get it out of your system. Show me what you've got, you magnificent bastard. I'm still here. I'm not hurting you. I'm just along for the ride." The crowd was screaming now, some in fear, some in excitement, Victoria's voice cutting through the noise with something that might have been genuine surprise. "Holy God, he's actually riding it!" Marcus was standing with his hands pressed to his mouth, looking like he might have a heart attack, alternating between pride and terror as he watched Dante work. The stallion reared up on his hind legs, pawing at the air with his front hooves, trying to tip backward and crush the rider beneath his weight, but Dante leaned forward, redistributing the balance, his hand pressing against the horse's neck, and the animal came back down with a frustrated snort. 30 seconds had passed, though it felt like hours, and the stallion was beginning to tire, his bucks becoming less energetic, more performative than genuinely violent. Dante could feel the shift in the animal's body, the way the fear was gradually transforming into something else. Maybe not trust, but at least a grudging acknowledgement that this rider was different from the others. "That's right. You're okay. We're okay. Nobody's getting hurt here today," Dante murmured, and he began asking the horse for something more than just survival, actually trying to direct the movement. He applied gentle pressure with his left leg, and the stallion, surprised by the request rather than a demand, actually responded, shifting his weight and beginning to move in a circle. It was rough, unpolished, the horse fighting the direction even as he followed it. But it was communication, a dialogue happening between two beings who spoke different languages, but were finding common ground. Dante asked for a trot, and after a moment of resistance, the stallion complied, his gait rough but powerful, eating up the ground with strides that spoke to his wild heritage. 45 seconds, 50, 55, and Dante guided the horse through a figure 8, nothing fancy but proof of control, proof that they were working together instead of against each other. When Marcus called out that 60 seconds had elapsed, his voice cracking with emotion, Dante didn't immediately dismount. Instead, he kept riding, taking the stallion through several more circles, gradually asking for more collected movements, letting the horse learn that cooperation brought calm instead of conflict. The animal was sweating heavily, his sides heaving, but his ears were forward now, listening, engaged, the terror replaced by something approaching curiosity. Finally, Dante brought him back to the trailer, dismounting with the same fluid grace he'd used to mount, his legs shaky when they hit the ground, but his expression calm. He stood by the stallion's head, stroking the dark nose, whispering praise that only the horse could hear. The crowd erupted in applause, people rushing forward to congratulate him, but Dante held up a hand, stopping them. "Don't crowd him. He's still processing everything, and too much stimulation will set him off again. Marcus, can you get him some water and walk him out slowly?" The old wrangler moved forward, tears actually running down his weathered cheeks, taking the reins with a gentleness that matched Dante's own. "Son, that was the finest piece of riding I've seen in 40 years. Your daddy would have been proud." The words hit Dante harder than any of the stallion's bucks, bringing a tightness to his throat that he had to swallow against. "Thank you," he managed, stepping back to let Marcus lead the horse away, watching until they disappeared into the stables, making sure the animal was being treated properly. Only then did he turn to face Victoria, who stood frozen with her phone still up. Her expression completely transformed from mocking superiority to something Dante couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, and maybe a touch of fear, as if she'd just realized that the person she'd been treating as furniture was actually human. "Well," she said finally, her voice lacking its usual edge, "I suppose I owe you some money." She gestured to one of her executives, the red-haired woman who pulled out a tablet and began typing furiously. $10 million is promised. I'll have the check drawn up immediately and delivered to you by end of business today." Dante felt the reality of what had just happened begin to crash over him like a wave, his hands starting to shake as the adrenaline drained from his system. $10 million. The amount was so large it felt abstract, impossible to conceptualize in terms of actual life change. "I'll need your full name, address, and social security number for the paperwork," the red-haired woman said, her tone professional but not unkind. He provided the information in a voice that sounded distant to his own ears, watching her input everything into the tablet with swift efficiency. Victoria hadn't moved, still watching him with that unsettled expression, her armor of superiority showing visible cracks. "Where did you learn to ride like that?" she asked, and for the first time since he'd met her, she sounded genuinely curious rather than condescending. "My father," Dante replied simply. "He ran a ranch in Montana, taught horse-breaking clinics. I grew up in the saddle." Victoria processed this, something flickering across her face that might have been shame. "And you're working as a janitor because?" The question was blunt, but at least it wasn't mocking. "Because life doesn't always go the way you plan it," Dante said, pulling off the riding gloves and handing them back to Marcus, who had returned from settling the stallion. "My father died. The ranch went to creditors, and I had a daughter to raise on my own. Janitorial work is steady, has benefits, works with my schedule so I can be there for her. Not glamorous, but it kept us afloat." Victoria flinched at the word afloat, perhaps hearing the implicit criticism of someone who'd never had to worry about drowning. "I apologize," she said quietly, and the words sounded strange coming from her, rusty with disuse. "I was cruel to you, treated you as less than human, and that was wrong." Dante studied her face, looking for sincerity, and found it buried under layers of discomfort and genuine regret. "Apology accepted," he said finally. "But maybe think about how you treat people moving forward, the janitors and the security guards and the servers who make your comfortable life possible. We're not props in your story. We're people with our own stories that are just as complex as yours. Victoria nodded slowly, looking like she'd been slapped with a truth she couldn't deflect. I will. I promise I will. The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze, Dante returning to his duties in a daze, while word of what had happened spread through the resort like wildfire. Other staff members who'd barely acknowledged his existence suddenly wanted to talk to him, shake his hand, hear the story firsthand. He deflected most of it, uncomfortable with the attention, counting down the hours until his shift ended and he could pick up Isabella from Mrs. Chen's apartment. When he finally clocked out at 4 o'clock, the red-haired executive was waiting for him by the employee exit, holding a manila envelope. "The check," she said, handing it over with a small smile. "Ms. Carter wanted me to tell you that she's also including a letter of recommendation, should you ever want to pursue work with horses professionally. She feels terrible about how she treated you and wants to make amends." Dante took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he felt the weight of it, literal and metaphorical. "Thank you," he managed. "And please tell her that the apology and the recommendation mean more than she probably realizes." He walked to his truck, an ancient Ford that burned oil and made concerning noises, and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before opening the envelope. The check was there, made out to Dante Rodriguez for $10 million, the numbers so large they looked like a joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was real. It was his. It was Isabella's future, transformed in an afternoon. Beneath the check was a handwritten letter on Titanium Technologies letterhead, Victoria's elegant script covering half a page. "Dear Dante," it read, "I owe you more than money. I owe you an apology for my behavior, not just today, but every day I've walked through this world assuming that wealth and position made me superior to others. Watching you ride that stallion, seeing the skill and courage and heart you brought to an impossible task, reminded me that excellence has nothing to do with job titles or bank balances. You are a remarkable person, an exceptional father, and from what I've seen, a horseman with talents that are being wasted in janitorial work. If you ever want to explore opportunities in the equestrian world, I have connections in that industry and would be honored to help. More than that, I promise to be better, to see the people around me as people, to remember that everyone I meet is fighting a battle I know nothing about. Thank you for the lesson. With deep respect and regret, Victoria Carter." Dante read the letter 3 times, feeling something loosen in his chest, some tight knot of anger and resentment that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. He wasn't naive enough to think that one afternoon had fundamentally changed who Victoria Carter was. People didn't transform overnight like characters in fairy tales, but maybe it had planted a seed, made her think twice before casually destroying someone's dignity. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could ask for, small moments of growth that accumulated over time into actual change. He drove to Mrs. Chen's apartment, parallel parking badly because his hands were still shaking, taking the stairs 2 at a time to the 3rd floor. Isabella answered Mrs. Chen's door, her face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that made everything Dante had endured worthwhile. "Papa!" she squealed, launching herself at him, and he caught her and lifted her up, burying his face in her dark curls that smelled like the lavender shampoo they used. "Hey, baby girl. How was school today?" She launched into a detailed account of the day's adventures while he thanked Mrs. Chen profusely and promised to bring her something special from the resort as thanks for always being reliable. Back in their own apartment, a cramped space that suddenly felt different now that he knew they wouldn't be trapped here forever, Dante made dinner while Isabella did her homework at the kitchen table. They ate spaghetti with meat sauce, her favorite, and he let her have extra cookies for dessert, a small celebration even though she didn't yet know what they were celebrating. After dinner, while she took her bath, he sat on the ancient couch and called the first number on a list he'd been compiling in his head for the past 3 hours. "Riverside Medical Center, how may I direct your call?" "Billing department, please." He was transferred, waited on hold listening to classical music that was supposed to be soothing, finally reached a woman named Sandra who spoke with the carefully neutral tone of someone who spent her days discussing money with people who didn't have enough of it. "Hi, my name is Dante Rodriguez, and I have outstanding medical bills for my daughter, Isabella Rodriguez, patient number 74392. I'd like to pay the entire balance, all of it today if possible." There was a pause, then the sound of typing. Mr. Rodriguez, your current balance across all accounts is $11,342.18. Did you want to set up a payment plan? Dante couldn't help smiling. No, I want to pay it all right now. All $11,342.18. Can you take a credit card? Another pause, longer this time. Sir, our system can process up to $5,000 per transaction. You'd need to call back and do multiple transactions, or you could mail a check. I'll mail a check tomorrow, Dante said, the relief flooding through him so intense it was almost painful. Thank you, Sandra. He hung up and immediately dialed his landlord, a perpetually annoyed man named Mr. Kowalski, who owned the building and treated maintenance requests like personal insults. Kowalski. Mr. Kowalski, this is Dante Rodriguez from apartment 3C. I wanted to let you know that I'll be moving out at the end of next month. I'm buying a house. Another long pause. You're what now? Buying a house, so I wanted to give you proper notice, follow the lease terms. I'll leave the place spotless, I promise. Mr. Kowalski made a sound like a deflating balloon. Huh, good for you, Rodriguez. You've been a good tenant, never caused trouble. Best of luck to you. The conversation was short and businesslike, but Dante felt like he'd just won a small victory. Reclaiming a piece of dignity that had been worn away by years of living in someone else's property under someone else's rules. Isabella emerged from her bath in her favorite pajamas, the ones covered in cartoon horses that he'd bought her for her 6th birthday, and he sat her down on the couch with unusual solemnity. Baby girl, I need to tell you something important. Her eyes went wide, immediately worried the way children get when adults use that tone. Am I in trouble? No, nothing like that. The opposite, actually. Something really good happened today, something that's going to change things for us. He explained it as simply as he could, about the horse and the challenge and the money, watching her face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally explosive joy when she understood what it meant. Does this mean I can get the nebulizer we saw at the doctor's office, the one you said was too expensive? The question broke his heart a little, that her first thought was about medical equipment, but he nodded firmly. Yes, absolutely. We're getting that nebulizer, and you're going to have the best doctors, and we're going to find a house with a yard where you can play outside without worrying about the stairs triggering your asthma. She threw her arms around his neck, and they sat like that for a long time, holding each other while the enormity of their changed circumstances slowly became real. That night, after he tucked her into bed and read her favorite story about a princess who tamed dragons, Dante stood in the doorway watching her sleep, her chest rising and falling with breaths that sounded clearer than they had in weeks. He thought about his father, about the ranch, about all the roads that had led him to this moment, and for the first time in 9 years, he felt something that might have been peace. The next morning, he called the resort manager and gave his 2 weeks' notice, explaining that he'd come into some money and needed to focus on setting up a new life for his daughter. The manager was understanding, even grateful, saying that Dante had been one of their most reliable employees and offering a glowing reference for whatever came next. Word had already spread through the entire resort about what had happened with the stallion, and Dante found himself something of a celebrity among the staff, people approaching him constantly to shake his hand and offer congratulations. He spent his final 2 weeks at the resort, working his regular shifts, but also spending time in the stables with Marcus, reacquainting himself with the world of horses that he'd left behind so long ago. The old wrangler was thrilled to have someone to talk to who truly understood the animals. And they spent hours discussing training techniques, bloodlines, the psychology of horses, and how it mirrored and diverged from human psychology. The black stallion, who Marcus had named Midnight in a fit of unoriginality, was gradually calming under consistent, respectful handling, and Dante worked with him daily, building a relationship based on trust instead of dominance. On his last day at the resort, Dante arrived to find his locker decorated with balloons and cards, the other janitors and housekeepers having organized a small going-away party during the lunch break. They'd pitched in to buy him a framed photo of the moment he'd mounted Midnight, captured by one of the Titanium Technologies employees, his face set in intense concentration, the stallion's muscles bunched beneath him, the image somehow conveying both the danger and the beauty of that impossible moment. He was genuinely touched, having to blink back tears as he thanked everyone, promising to stay in touch and never forget where he came from. Victoria Carter had left the resort 2 days after the incident, her corporate retreat continuing as planned despite the disruption, but she'd sent several follow-up emails that Dante had found waiting in the inbox he rarely checked. She'd connected him with 3 different ranch owners looking for experienced horse trainers, a California mogul who bred show horses, a Texas rancher who specialized in Mustang rehabilitation, and a Montana outfit that ran horsemanship clinics similar to what his father had done. The Montana option called to him with a pull he couldn't quite explain, the idea of returning to his home state, of coming full circle in a way that honored his father's memory without being trapped by it. He and Isabella spent the next month in a flurry of activity, house hunting in small Montana towns where their money would stretch further and the pace of life would be gentler than what they'd known. They found a place outside of Bozeman, a modest 3-bedroom house on 5 acres with a barn that needed work but had good bones, distant views of mountains that took Isabella's breath away, and enough land for a few horses if Dante decided to pursue training seriously. The price was $350,000. Leaving him with more than enough to invest conservatively, set up college funds, and create the security he'd always dreamed of providing. Moving day was chaotic and joyful, the 2 of them, plus a small crew of hired movers transferring their meager possessions into a space that felt impossibly large after years in the cramped apartment. Isabella ran from room to room, her laughter echoing off walls that were theirs, really theirs. No landlord to answer to, no constant fear of eviction if he fell behind on rent. They set up her bedroom first, painting the walls a soft purple that she'd chosen herself, hanging curtains covered in stars, arranging her stuffed animals on shelves that Dante built from scratch because he could, because they had time and money and freedom. That first night in the new house, they made a campfire in the backyard, roasting marshmallows and watching the stars emerge in a sky unpolluted by city lights. Isabella was quiet, processing everything, and Dante let her sit with her thoughts, not rushing to fill the silence. Finally she said, "Papa, why did that lady give you so much money? Just for riding a horse?" It was a good question, one he'd been thinking about himself, trying to find an answer that would make sense to a 7-year-old. "I think she was trying to embarrass me," he said honestly, "trying to make me look foolish in front of all those people because she thought I was less important than her. But sometimes people's attempts to hurt us can backfire, can end up helping us instead. And maybe, just maybe, seeing that she was wrong about me made her think about other things she might be wrong about how she treats people." Isabella considered this, her face serious in the firelight. "So she's not a bad person?" Dante thought about Victoria's letter, about the genuine regret in her apology. "I don't think anyone's completely bad or completely good, baby girl. We all make mistakes, hurt people we shouldn't hurt. What matters is whether we're willing to learn and change." He started working for the Montana Ranch in early November, a sprawling operation called Clearwater Stables that bred quarter horses and offered training clinics for riders of all levels. The owner, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd made her fortune in tech before retiring to pursue her passion for horses, had been the most enthusiastic respondent to Victoria's introductions. She'd called Dante directly after receiving the glowing recommendation, asking him to ride a few of her more difficult horses as a kind of audition, and within 20 minutes of watching him work, she had offered him a position as head trainer with a salary that would have seemed absurd 3 months earlier. The work was physically demanding but spiritually nourishing in a way that janitorial work had never been, the kind of labor that left him exhausted but satisfied, his muscles remembering skills they'd missed, his mind engaged with problems that actually mattered to him. He worked with horses that others had given up on, animals that had been abused or traumatized or simply misunderstood, and he found that his own experience with trauma gave him a particular empathy for their suffering. He could see himself in their fear, their mistrust, their desperate need for someone to prove that not all humans would hurt them. Isabella thrived in Montana, her asthma improving dramatically in the clean mountain air, her confidence growing as she made new friends at a small school that actually had resources and teachers who cared. She started taking riding lessons herself, under Dante's careful supervision, beginning with an ancient mare named Butterscotch, who had the patience of a saint and the speed of a glacier. Watching his daughter in the saddle, seeing her face light up with the same joy he'd felt at her age, brought Dante a happiness so profound it sometimes made him ache. Winter came early and hard that year, blanketing their 5 acres in 3 feet of snow that Isabella found magical and Dante found exhausting to shovel. They bought a truck that actually ran properly, a used F-150 that didn't leak oil or make concerning noises, and Dante taught his daughter how to build a proper snowman using techniques his own father had shown him, before the drinking had consumed everything good. Christmas was modest but joyful, presents wrapped in recycled paper, a small tree that they decorated together while singing along badly to carols on the radio, the kind of simple family celebration that Dante had always imagined but never quite achieved. On New Year's Eve, he received an unexpected email from Victoria Carter, checking in to see how he was settling into his new life. They'd maintained sporadic contact over the past 2 months, brief exchanges that gradually evolved from awkward apologies into something resembling actual conversation. She told him about changes she was making at Titanium Technologies, implementing new policies around employee respect and dignity, organizing listening sessions where janitors and security guards and cafeteria workers could voice concerns directly to leadership. Were the changes perfect? No. Were they transforming the entire corporate culture overnight? Absolutely not. But they were something, small steps toward a more humane workplace, and Dante found himself proud of her for trying. He replied with photos of the ranch, of Isabella on Butterscotch, of Midnight, who Sarah had purchased from the resort, and who was slowly learning to trust humans again under Dante's patient guidance. "You changed my life," he wrote, "not just with the money, though obviously that was significant, but by reminding me that I had value beyond my job title, skills that mattered, a past worth honoring instead of running from. I hope you know that the best outcome of that day wasn't the check, it was both of us learning something about ourselves." Victoria's response came quickly, longer than her usual brief messages. "I've been thinking a lot about worthiness lately, about how we assign value to people based on arbitrary markers like income or education or job prestige. You were a better man working as a janitor than I was running a billion-dollar company, because you had humility and kindness and genuine care for others. I'm trying to learn those things now, but they don't come naturally to someone who spent 20 years climbing over people to reach the top. Thank you for being patient with me, for not dismissing my attempts to change as performative or insincere. They might have started that way. I'm honest enough to admit that. But they've become real." Spring arrived gradually, the snow melting to reveal brown earth that slowly transformed into green as wildflowers began their annual explosion of color. Dante stood in his barn one morning, grooming Midnight, who now nuzzled his shoulder affectionately instead of trying to bite, thinking about the strange trajectory his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been drowning in debt and desperation, invisible to everyone except his daughter, convinced that this was all there would ever be. Now he owned land, had meaningful work, watched Isabella grow into herself without the constant shadow of poverty crushing her possibilities. The black stallion huffed warm breath against his neck, and Dante smiled, scratching behind the horse's ears. "You and me, we've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" Midnight's tail swished contentedly, and Dante felt grateful for everything, even the hard parts, even the years of struggle, because all of it had led here, to this moment, to a life he'd stopped believing was possible. He thought about his father sometimes, wondered what Miguel would make of his son's redemption, hoped that wherever he was, whatever existed beyond this life, he could see that the skills he'd beaten into his son with harsh words and harsher hands had ultimately become a path to salvation rather than a prison. Sarah appeared in the barn doorway, waving a piece of paper. "Dante, you've got to see this. Someone from the American Quarter Horse Association wants to feature you in their magazine. Do a whole profile about your comeback story and your rehabilitation work with traumatized horses. They're calling you the Horse Whisperer of Montana, which I know is cheesy as hell, but the exposure would be incredible for the ranch." Dante felt his stomach clench with the old instinct to hide, to avoid attention, but he pushed past it, recognizing that visibility wasn't the same as vulnerability. "Okay," he said, surprising himself. "Let's do it. Maybe our story can help other people who are struggling. Show them that circumstances can change, that you're never too old or too broken to rebuild." The article came out 2 months later, a glossy spread with professional photos of Dante working with Midnight, of Isabella learning to ride, of the ranch with its mountain backdrop looking like something from a Western painting. The writer had done her homework, tracking down Marcus, who provided colorful quotes about Dante's talents, even contacting Victoria, who gave a surprisingly candid interview about her own transformation. "That day changed me," Victoria was quoted as saying. "I realized I'd been looking at people like they were functions instead of individuals, seeing the job instead of the human being performing it. Dante reminded me that everyone has a story. Everyone has value that goes beyond their economic productivity, and treating people with basic dignity isn't some radical concept. It's the bare minimum of decent behavior. I'm grateful for the lesson, even though I'm embarrassed it took such a dramatic demonstration to teach it to me." The magazine feature brought unexpected attention, inquiries from other ranches wanting to send their difficult horses to Dante, emails from people who'd been inspired by the story. Even a few interview requests from Morning Talk shows that he politely declined because national television sounded like actual nightmare. But he did agree to teach clinics at Clearwater Stables, weekend intensives where he shared his father's techniques, filtered through his own more compassionate approach, showing riders how to build relationships with horses based on mutual respect rather than dominance and fear. His first clinic sold out within 3 days of being announced, 20 riders paying $500 each to spend 2 days learning from someone they'd read about in a magazine. Dante was terrified the night before, lying awake in bed wondering if he could actually teach what came to him so instinctively. If he could translate feeling and intuition into concrete techniques that others could learn. But when the first morning came and he stood in front of those 20 expectant faces, he found his voice, the same calm, steady tone he used with horses, and the words flowed naturally. He taught them about reading body language, about the difference between asking and demanding, about patience and consistency, and the deep listening required to truly understand an animal that couldn't speak your language. He demonstrated with Midnight, showing how a horse that had been written off as untrainable could become a willing partner when treated with respect. The riders watched in awe as he guided the stallion through complex movements using barely visible cues. His body and the horses moving in perfect synchronization, and Dante realized this was why he'd gone through everything he'd gone through, so he could be here, now, sharing this knowledge with people who wanted to learn. By the end of summer, he was teaching 2 clinics a month, building a reputation that extended beyond Montana, fielding calls from California and Texas and even international inquiries. The money was good, better than he'd ever imagined earning, and he invested most of it, determined to never again experience the terror of financial insecurity. But he also donated to causes that mattered, scholarships for single parents trying to better their circumstances, programs that helped troubled kids through equine therapy, the organizations he wished had existed when he needed them most. Isabella turned 8 in September, and they threw a party at the ranch with her new school friends, a crowd of giggling children who rode ponies and ate cake and played games in the barn while their parents stood around making small talk and occasionally glancing at Dante with the starstruck expressions of people who'd read the magazine article. He felt awkward with the attention, but grateful for the normalcy of it, for the simple joy of watching his daughter blow out candles and make a wish he hoped would come true, whatever it was. That night, after the guests had left and Isabella was asleep with a smile on her face, Dante sat on his porch, watching the stars emerge, feeling the kind of bone-deep contentment that he'd never quite believed was real. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Saw photos of Isabella's party on social media, looked wonderful. I hope you don't mind, but I set up a college fund for her. $250,000 should cover any school she chooses. Consider it a continuation of my apology, an investment in making sure that bright little girl has every opportunity. She deserves it. And so do you." Dante stared at the message for a long time, emotions swirling too complex to name. Gratitude, certainly, and lingering discomfort at accepting more from someone who'd once mocked him, but also recognition that Victoria was genuinely trying to be better, that her attempts at restitution came from a real place of growth. He typed a response, deleted it, typed another, finally settled on something simple. "Thank you, that's incredibly generous. Isabella's going to be something special someday, partially because of people like you who give her chances to become whatever she dreams of being. I forgive you completely, for everything, and I'm proud of the changes you're making." The years that followed were the kind that don't make good stories because they were simply good. Long stretches of normal happiness unmarked by crisis or drama. Dante continued training horses and teaching clinics, his reputation growing until he was considered one of the best in the business, people traveling from around the world to study with him. Isabella grew tall and confident, her asthma fading to occasional inconvenience rather than constant threat, her grades excellent, her collection of riding ribbons and trophies taking over an entire wall of her bedroom. When she was 12, she asked about her mother for the first time in years, and Dante told her the truth without embellishment about a woman he'd loved, who'd loved their daughter, but couldn't overcome her own demons, who'd left when Isabella was 18 months old to chase something she could never quite name, about how he'd tried to find her, to bring her back. But some people were meant to be ghosts in your life story. Isabella cried, but they were the kind of tears that cleansed rather than festered, and afterward she hugged him tight and said, "You've always been enough. Papa, you've always been more than enough." Midnight lived to the impressive age of 23, spending his final years in peaceful retirement, grazing in Dante's pasture, and occasionally allowing Isabella to ride him gently around the property, the wild stallion transformed into a gentle grandfather. When he died quietly in his sleep one autumn morning, Dante and Isabella buried him on the property under a cottonwood tree, marking the spot with a simple stone that read, "Midnight, who taught us that the wildest spirits can still choose connection." They stood together in the early morning cold, arms around each other, and Dante thought about how much that horse had changed his life, how a single moment of courage had transformed everything. Victoria retired from Titanium Technologies when she was 55, selling the company for an astronomical sum and immediately funneling most of it into philanthropic ventures focused on economic mobility and workers' rights. She visited the ranch once, awkward in designer jeans that had clearly never seen actual ranch work, petting butterscotch with the nervous enthusiasm of someone who'd never really understood horses. She and Dante talked for hours that day, about the paths their lives had taken, about regret and redemption, and whether people could really change or just learn to hide their worst impulses better. "I think real change is possible," Dante said, "but it requires constant effort, constant vigilance against sliding back into old patterns. You're doing the work, and that's what matters." Victoria smiled, looking more at peace than he'd ever seen her. "You know, that day at the resort, I thought I was teaching you a lesson about knowing your place, but you taught me that everyone has a place, and it's not determined by wealth or status. It's determined by character, by how we treat others, by whether we have the courage to be honest about who we are." Years later, when Isabella graduated high school as valedictorian with a full scholarship to veterinary school, Dante stood in the audience watching her give her speech, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. She talked about resilience, about her father, who'd shown her that dignity wasn't something granted by others, but something you carried within yourself, about how a single moment of courage could change everything, not just for you, but for everyone watching. After the ceremony, as they drove home through the Montana twilight with the mountains painting shadows across the highway, Isabella reached over and squeezed his hand. "Papa, I never asked what you wished for that day when you decided to ride Midnight. What were you thinking about?" Dante considered the question, remembering that morning, the fear and desperation and impossible hope. "I was thinking about you," he said simply, "about giving you a better life than I had, about breaking the cycle of poverty and struggle. I was thinking that sometimes you have to risk everything to gain anything, and that loving someone means being brave even when you're terrified." She was quiet for a moment, watching the landscape blur past. "It worked," she said softly. You gave me everything, Papa, not just the money or the house or the opportunities, but the example of what it means to never give up, to maintain your dignity even when others try to take it away, to be kind even when the world is cruel. Dante felt tears sting his eyes, the good kind that came from overwhelming gratitude. You gave me just as much, baby girl. You were the reason I got up every morning, the reason I kept fighting when everything seemed hopeless. We saved each other. As they pulled into their driveway, the barn lights glowing warm against the gathering darkness, Dante thought about that day at the resort, about Victoria's mocking challenge and the wild stallion and the 60 seconds that had changed everything. He thought about his father, about the ranch in Montana where he'd learned to ride, about all the pain and struggle that had led him here, to this moment, to this life he'd built from broken pieces. And he realized that the real gift hadn't been the $10 million. The real gift had been remembering who he was beneath all the years of survival, rediscovering the part of himself he'd thought was lost forever. The money had bought security and opportunity, but the ride itself had bought something far more valuable: his dignity, his identity, his belief that he was more than circumstances had tried to make him. That night, standing in his barn with the horses munching hay peacefully in their stalls, Dante whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided him through the darkness and back into the light. He thanked his father, despite everything, for teaching him the skills that had saved them. He thanked Victoria for her cruelty that had accidentally become kindness. He thanked Midnight for being wild enough to be worth $10 million and gentle enough to trust a broken man. But mostly, he thanked Isabella for being the reason that mattered more than any amount of money, the purpose that had kept him alive when surviving felt impossible. The horses nickered softly in response, and Dante smiled, running his hand along the barn's worn wood, feeling the solid reality of everything he'd built. This was enough, more than enough. This was everything he'd ever needed, had been inside him all along, waiting for one impossible moment to set it free.